Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Debaters Council's Motion Debrief series for the Francis Chapman Memorial Championship Trophy 2025. My name is Gavin Senaratne. I am a debater for the University of Murtua Engineering Faculty Debate Team, and I am also the coach for Visakha Vidyalaya Colombo. The motion I'll be covering today is This House regrets the emphasis on voting for political parties rather than focusing on the individual in Sri Lanka. And just off the top of my head, like when I'm reading this motion, it seems pretty straightforward. So I'm assuming the reason this was requested was perhaps a lack of context on what this motion looks like and like what the backdrop of this motion is. So I'll cover that first before moving into the cases, and I'll cover those very briefly. Um, so the first thing we need to cover is what exactly does the emphasis on voting for political parties in Sri Lanka look like? And the Infoslide covers this to a certain extent, where you say that voters have predominantly followed a party-based system in state and provincial elections, prioritizing party affiliation over individual candidates. But I'll just expand a bit on this and give you a bit of an idea of the counterfactual as well, because one thing to note in this motion is typically a research regrets motion doesn't give you the counterfactual, but here the counterfactual is given, which is rather than focusing on the individual, which means that they want you to focus on the individual as the counterfactual. Um, so, what would the counterfactual look like? Well, I think it will look like something like the presidential election, because if you think about presidential elections, they don't typically vote based on party lines, right? So, for example, um, let's start with like the 2009 election. Mahinda Rajapaksa came from his own party, whereas Sarath Fonseca created a new party. In 2015, again, Mahinda Rajapaksa came from his alliance, and Maithripala Sirisena had a new party. In 2020, both Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Sajith Premadasa created new parties. And in 2025, Anur Kumar Dissanayake created his own party, Ranil Wickremesinghe created his own party, and Sajith Premadasa ran from the party that he created in 2020. So in presidential elections, at least in recent history, the whole party loyalty thing hasn't been a big deal, and it's been focused primarily on the individual and seeing how that individual compares over the other. In comparison, the parliamentary elections are completely different, and people generally vote based on the party. In the past, this used to be like generational allegiances to parties based on like favors done for their ancestors or for their areas or things like that. So you would have people who would, like legacy UNP voters who would never consider voting for the JVP or the SLFP. Um, and similarly, you would have like legacy voters of each of these parties. Uh, that sort of changed in recent history because again, because the legacy political parties were broken down, and instead the trend that we see is that whichever party the president is from, that party ends up getting a two-thirds majority in the parliament. So in 2009, Mahinda Rajapaksa won the election; his party got a two-thirds majority. In 2015, it was a bit of a mess, and no one had a clear majority in the parliament. But then 2020, Gotabaya Rajapaksa wins the election, his party gets a two-thirds majority. 2025, Anur Kumar Dissanayake, or 2024, Anur Kumar Dissanayake wins the election and his party gets a two-third majority in the parliament. So the broad trend is that whichever party the president is from, people broadly vote for that party regardless of who's running from it, simply because there is this like belief, or there is this, at the very least, like campaigning platform that you need to give a strong parliament to support what the president wants to do. So with that in mind, let's move on to the cases and like compare what the issues with both of these things are, right? So first up, proposition, a few ideas, right? So what happens when people don't focus on the individual and focus entirely on the party instead? The simplest and most straightforward impact is just people go out and end up voting for random people simply because they run from the party that they have an allegiance to. And the again, the most straightforward impact of this is that you just get bad candidates, and they end up having like a ton of political scandals. If you think about, for example, the Speaker of the Parliament, um, in like the current government. He faked his degree apparently, and there was a big deal surrounding that. Like this isn't something that would happen if it was an established candidate that was known in these regions, that they're running for election from. And so you have a lot of these scandals. You have a lot of people who go to parliament, and you're like, okay, this guy is pretty terrible. The moment you see them stand up and speak, and these kind of things wouldn't happen if you had an election system focused on the individual. So just get that out of the way, right? You're going to get bad candidates, and bad candidates are going to create political scandals, and also bad candidates are going to be terrible once they get into parliament. The second sort of idea is something a bit less straightforward, which is that candidates no longer have an incentive to be good. So the first thing was you'd get objectively bad candidates, but now after these people get elected into power, or like when these people are campaigning, they have no incentive to create a good platform or to do a good job once they get into power. Uh, and the simple reason for this is, again, your track record doesn't matter. What matters is whether the party is doing well or not. So this can be analyzed in like two ways, which is that one, people just don't have an incentive to do anything important because they know that if the party is doing well, they will get that seat. But the second part of it is sort of, once you get into power, no matter what you do, your fate depends on whether people like your party or not, and whether your party wins in the presidential election, which again means that the parliamentarians don't necessarily have an incentive to do things that win them the votes of the people. So this looks like making sure that the roads are built, or making sure that you uh, campaign for region specific issues when you're in the parliament. Now, this is somewhat true for perhaps minority politicians, especially like parliamentarians from the northern province, where like these parties like the Langi Tamilas Kachi have the majority and where they win the elections. In such instances, maybe it is important for the parliamentarians to do something for their region, but broadly speaking, for the rest of the country, it's not really that important. Now, the impact of this is again basically that you have a lower focus on regional issues when these parliamentarians run for election. And what I mean by this is, typically the way we imagine democracy to work, or in an ideal world, the way you'd imagine democracy to work, is that you have a large amount of constituencies that are all like fighting for their particular issues. And ultimately, when all of these ideas get together, you come up with an equitable solution for everyone. And having like one parliamentarian going out there and like fighting for your issues creates a voice in the parliament, and therefore it can like bring attention, or like bring national attention and funding to problems that might be in certain areas. A good example of this is, for example, the estate workers in like Norelia and that region, and how they always have like one like candidate from the workers congress getting into power, and that guy's job is basically to highlight their issues and talk about it. But these are like fringe cases. In an ideal world, you'd want to have similar people in the parliament from every single electorate. So those are the issues on prop, basically, that one, you just have terrible candidates. Secondly, even if you have candidates with the potential to be good, they don't have an incentive to do anything good. And thirdly, that you have less focus on regional issues. Which brings me to opposition. And again, on opposition, what happens is you have a system where you focus on the individual. And now it becomes a question of, well, what does a like scenario that focuses on the individual look like? Uh, Now, in the past in Sri Lanka, we did have this thing where each electorate had a seat assigned to it in the parliament, and whoever won that seat would go to the parliament. And so, therefore, people would campaign within their own electorate and try to win over the votes of the people. And if you've like read your history books, you will know that back in the day there were like a ton of different parties that would obtain multiple seats in the Sri Lankan parliament. Most notably, like the Socialist Party, or the Communist Party, or just other parties representing a broad range of political ideologies. And the reason that you had such a broad range of parties wasn't necessarily because Sri Lanka was that ideologically diverse that it required that many parties, but that there were individuals in each electorate who were popular among the people of that electorate and were able to get into power no matter what party they ran from. So as a consequence, they had a tendency to, form their own parties or like get into parties with a bunch of their friends or whatever. And so there are a few issues that come about with that as well. And if you look around the world, you'll see this, that a lot of countries within their parliaments, unless they have like a two-party system, have trouble establishing a majority. Like they have trouble establishing a government to begin working. And the problem with this is, well, one, it's just very inefficient and a waste of resources. And more often than not, you can't pass budgets, the country gets stalled, lots of economic losses. These are potential things that would be very harmful for Sri Lanka. But the second issue is that many minority parties gain an undue advantage. And when you're saying minority parties, you obviously want to be strategic about it. You don't want to say that, racial minority parties or whatever gain an undue advantage, because then the judge is going to think that you're a racist and give you the loss on that basis. Instead, you talk about, like, for example, in the Israel parliament, where you have a lot of factions and where these parties struggle to establish a government, you say perhaps the extremist Zionists gain an undue advantage. Or in the British parliament, you would say that the British or the German parliament, that the alt-right nationalists gain an undue advantage. And based on that, you can like frame the problem, right? That extremists gain a larger platform. But also there is just the idea that minority parties shouldn't gain an undue advantage simply because it's undemocratic. And they shouldn't be able to wield an undue amount of influence on how a nation is governed. And so that's one of the problems that comes about, because parties need to form coalitions in order to form governments. And in the process of forming coalitions, they need to make promises, and these promises can be harmful for certain groups and give undue influence for minority parties or like extremist parties in the worst case scenario. But the second reason that we would want to have emphasis on voting for political parties as opposed to emphasis on individuals is having a focus on individuals. You basically flip the argument that we made in proposition, where we say that you get to focus on regional issues. Instead, you say that focusing on regional issues and focusing on the issues of electorates is actually a bad thing, and you don't want that. And instead, you want to get a representation of the national sentiment on certain things. Um, an example of this would be, for example, when Maithripala Sirisena was elected, the platform was basically abolishing the executive presidency and the abuse of power that came along with it. And if you had, a scenario where people were focused on perhaps voting for individuals from the electorates, you might not have been able to gather the national sentiment on abolishing the executive presidency and getting that passed through in the parliament. Similarly, if you look at one of the more serious examples, which is re-establishing the power of the executive presidency in 2020 when Gotabaya Rajapaksa came into power. Again, he was given a two-thirds majority for that platform, right? That he needs the power of the parliament in order to gather back power to the presidency and make sure that the president can do what he wants. There are other examples of this, but I think if you want to frame it in a debate, you should probably focus on something like economic policy, which is, which sort of nations do you want to align with? Do you want like a more libertarian, free market approach to things, or do you want to like continue maintaining the welfare state? These are the kind of policies that you want to get the national sentiment on, because these are things that affect every single person when they're passed in the parliament. And if you have a system where you focus on voting for individuals, you might not necessarily gather the national sentiment on those issues, compared to a system where you vote for parties. Because the good thing about parties is they unite a lot of people under one common platform. And so when you vote for the party, you know what you're getting. You know that you're only getting the things in the party manifesto and nothing more and nothing less. But when you are voting for individuals over parties, what happens is you just get a ton of parties in the mix. A coalition forms the government, and you don't really know what that coalition stands for, because it's like a melting pot of different ideologies of people put together. And so it's very hard for that coalition to represent the national sentiment on any like major issues that impact the entire country. Um, so those are the main ideas here. One is the specific versus broad thing, and the second thing is just broadly on democracy and how um, it affects either side. So yeah, that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to mention about this motion. Obviously, there are other aspects as well for voting for individuals or parties. I strongly urge you to read up on the benefits of having political parties because they might not really be evident looking at the system that we have in Sri Lanka. But yeah, all things considered, I hope you learned something from this video, and we hope to see you all on our future debriefs as well.